So as some of you may know, the dojo is really big on classical chess. And in fact, one of the main requirements of the dojo training program is for students to play classical time control games, either in person at tournaments over the board or online, and to then submit those games with their annotations to our training database. So now it's been about 2.5 months into the program. People have been playing and submitting games left and right, and we've collected over 1,100 games into our training database, which is pretty cool. So I thought it'd be interesting to do a little bit of a statistical analysis on these games and to just kind of see which openings are scoring better than others and whether certain openings perform better or worse depending on the rating range that they're being played at. Now you might say, Kostya, 1,100 games is a lot, but that's nothing compared to the database of games they have on chess.com or Lichess. But I feel like when you play online chess against the pool, a lot of these games, they get abandoned early on, or one side or both sides just treat the game like a blitz game. So it feels like the quality of the games is kind of hard to select for. Whereas I feel like with the Dojo database, we have games that are coming from tournaments, student versus student, and I feel like the overall quality of these games is actually quite good. So before we get into the numbers, let me first make a couple of disclaimers and offer some limitations of my so-called analysis. Number one, I'm a chess player slash teacher first. I'm not a classically trained scientist. And my idea here was not to draw any kind of objective conclusions or anything like that, but rather just to look at a bunch of games and see if I can come up with any kind of useful insights based on the numbers. But you guys are not allowed to treat this video with, the typical scientific rigor that you see on YouTube. Number two, some of the results and the ratings on these games might not be totally accurate, as these are all submitted by the students. So sometimes when entering data, people can get stuff wrong in terms of the results of the game or the ratings of the opponents and so on, and that might affect the results. And on the ratings, I should note that these are really a mix of ratings that have been submitted as well. So some of these games have been played on chess.com using the chess.com rapid rating. Some of these games have been played on Lichess using the Lichess classical rating. A lot of these are just tournament games using USCF or FIDE or CFC ratings or something like that. So what that means is that the average ratings here are not going to be totally reliable, as the rating systems are all different, but it still might give you a general idea as to which openings, again, are maybe scoring a little bit better at lower levels versus higher levels. And finally, this might be the most important disclaimer I can make in this entire video. The openings that work for some players may not work for everybody else. So I believe choosing the right opening is more than about just looking at the numbers and trying to figure out which openings are scoring best, but rather thinking about what kinds of positions you want to reach out of the opening and what kinds of middle games you want to play, and ultimately what kind of player you want to be. But with that, let's finally take a look at some numbers. So here we've got the stats of all the games collected in our database. And I'll just quickly go through all the different columns and explain what we're seeing here. First column here, we have the number of games. So the total number of games that I looked at was 1,118. 723 of these games started with E4, 270 started with D4, and so on, C4, knight F3, and then 25 games featuring another kind of opening move, one B3, one F4. There were some E3s, some D3s, some G3s, and so on. In the next column, you can see the average rating of the players in these games that had white, as well as the average rating for the players playing black. As you can see, the two average ratings of the group of players in all the games was actually very, very similar. That's usually what happens when you have just a ton of players. I'll say the sample had players ranging from under 1,000, under 800, all the way up to 23 and 2,400. Here you can see the average ratings of the players that started with these first moves, as well as the average rating of their opponents. As we can see, actually, we had a slightly higher average rating of players going D4, C4, and knight F3, and then somewhat lower average rating when it comes to some of these random first opening moves, B3 and F4, and so on. In this column here, you get the expected score given the average rating of the players in these games. So in some cases, if the players have a very even average rating, then you would see an expected score close to 50%, but slightly above, because with white you are getting a little bit of an advantage. So you can see the expected score for each of the selection of games here. This one is 48%, since in this pairing it was black that had a somewhat higher average rating. And then in the next column, you can see the actual score of what actually happened in these games. And of course, the difference here in the very next column, just to give you guys a chance to compare. So for the most part, when you take a look at all the games, you see that white was outperforming the expected score by a little bit, just about 2%. But then you see 3% in the E4 games, 2% in the D4 games, which seems pretty standard for the full sample. But of course, already some surprising numbers here. As we can see, the move 1 c4 greatly outperformed the expected score, almost 11% there, while the move 1 knight f3, for whatever reason, underperformed, as did these other first moves, b3, f4, and so on. These seem to perform much worse given the expected score with the ratings of the players. So of course, the fact that 1b3 and 1f4 isn't scoring particularly great for white, I think, is not a huge surprise. But the fact that 1 knight f3 doesn't score so well definitely was surprising, and would not be something that I would have expected. But it should be noted that for the games featuring 1 c4, 1 knight f3, and these other moves, of course, we don't have a ton of games in the sample size here. But of course, it is interesting that the move 1 c4 is scoring so well for white. And this actually made me want to dig in a bit deeper. And so as you can see, I actually broke down the games based on the ratings of the players being under 1600, where both players were under 1600, or versus both players being above 1600 in this column. So you can kind of see how these different opening moves compare against one another when you have higher rated players versus lower rated players. And when we look at the numbers for the English opening 1 c4, we can see a very clear difference here. 1 c4 tends to score extremely well for white, under 1600, close to 70% here, whereas above 1600, it scores closer to the typical 50%. Here you have a difference column, just highlighting the difference between the under 1600 score with white and the above 1600 score with white, just to get a sense of the gap here as well. And finally, these two columns just show the performance ratings of both sides within the set of each games. So in general, of course, higher performance rating is better. So already here, we can kind of start to guess that maybe the English is somewhat of a difficult opening to deal with for lower rated players. And that kind of makes sense. In general, the English is one of those openings where white is just kind of playing their structure. They're not really relying on a lot of like opening theory or tricks, but rather white puts the pawn on c4, they put the pawn on g3, bishop goes to g2, and then white kind of gets a very comfortable setup out of the get-go. So stronger players are definitely more equipped of playing against the English, but lower rated players I've definitely seen struggle. The other interesting insight I just wanted to point out here is that it seems like 1 e4 actually scores quite well under the 1600 level. And again, these are ratings that have been taken from a mix of chess.com, Lichess ratings, OTB ratings. So don't view this 1600 number as something set in stone. It's just to give you an idea. And what I found in general was that as you go up or down the rating scale, in general, D4 tends to score better at higher levels. You can see here the score is 56.5% for white, compared to 50.4% for the under 1600 players. In E4, from what I saw, generally tends to score better at lower levels and then kind of stabilizes at higher levels. Now, 49% for white at higher levels is a bit surprising. You would think that white should be scoring above 50%. But yeah, it just goes to show that apparently E4 gets a bit harder to play as you go up in rating. So does this mean you should just start playing the English if you are under 1600? I would really advise against it, unless this is your opening and you're a big fan of English opening legends like Karpov, Sarawan, Anderson, and all these guys. So if it's the opening for you, then by all means play it. But if you're a happy 1e4 player or happy d4 player, and all of a sudden you're thinking, you should switch just to get a couple extra rating points, let me just stop you right there. The best openings are the ones that are going to match your style as well as the type of player that you would like to be. Moving on to some black openings, starting with the major black openings against 1e4. You can see some more numbers here. And yeah, some interesting numbers here as well as some further insights as I kind of try to dig into these numbers a little bit. No surprise, e4, e5, Sicilian, Caro-Kann, these are kind of the most popular openings across many levels. French is as well. Though I found that at lower levels, the French definitely kind of loses popularity compared to higher levels. And so first thing I noticed here was, of course, that 1e5 is actually scoring really, really well for white if you look at all the games. But then if you break up the games based on the ratings of the players, you see that 1e5 scoring really well for white under 1600, and then above 1600, it's actually one of the best scoring openings for black. When it comes to the Sicilian, we see that the Sicilian kind of matches that overall gap that we saw when we looked at all 1100 games, where white is scoring just slightly better than expected. However, if you look at the Sicilian broken down by rating, you can see that again, white is scoring better. Pretty much in almost all of these openings, white is scoring better under 1600 compared to above 1600, with the exception of the French, which actually seems to score better for black at lower levels compared to higher levels. And my feeling on this is actually similar to the English opening. I think a lot of players as white kind of struggle against the French when they're first starting out or developing. They're not exactly sure how to crack black's defenses, and it often feels like the French player as black is quite familiar with the structure. So that could be what we're seeing represented here. And as we go up to higher levels, it seems like white is kind of scoring back to the normal 50-53% against the French. So does that mean you should play the French as black and try to win all your games? Well, I don't know. If it's the right opening for you, maybe that could be a good idea. But a lot of players, I'm sure they will struggle with the French, not used to having the space disadvantage and the bad light score bishop. Personally, I wouldn't recommend it unless you really feel like it's the opening for you. But what this does mean is maybe if you are a 1e4 player and you're struggling against the French, then that might be a sign that you maybe need to practice a bit more, maybe do a little bit more sparring and work on these types of positions. Another big difference we can see is the Caro-Kann scores 54%, which is about average for under 1600 players. But above 1600, definitely an opening that does not score well for white. So a lot of Caro-Kann players above the 1600 level seem to be doing well. And another opening that e4 players might want to work on a bit more. Because you guys are scoring well against e4, e5, at least at lower levels, scoring well against the Sicilian, at least when you're playing the open Sicilian. But against the Caro-Kann, definitely seems like white could be doing better. So some more useful insights. I found that when it comes to games with e4, e5, the move 2 knight c3, leading to the Vienna game usually. Only 19 games in our database, but white was scoring 78.9%, which is quite significant. A lot of these games were definitely on the lower end of the rating scale, but still, 2 knight c3 seems to be scoring well. And then a very interesting thing when it comes to the Sicilian I noticed is that in general, the sidelines weren't scoring that great for white. So things like 2c3, 2 knight c3, Grand Prix attack, close Sicilian, c3 Sicilian, Smith-Morra gambit. None of this was particularly special for white, but the open Sicilian, so when white is going knight f3 and d4, this was scoring actually quite well. And the total performance rating for white across all of the open Sicilian games was about 1755 for white versus 1509 for black. Granted, the players playing white had a slightly higher average rating, but still quite a significant difference in terms of the overall performance rating when it comes to the open Sicilian. So that definitely suggests that against the Sicilian, perhaps the open Sicilian is the way to go if you want to, let's say, play the most ambitious approach. Some more insights when it comes to the Caro-Kann, 3e5. and 3 e takes d5 seem to be scoring the best overall, approximately 55% there for white. And when it comes to the French, it seems like the most successful line, just in terms of the stats, was 3 knight c3, the classical main line. Next up, we have the stats here of black openings against 1 d4. And here I basically divided it into 1 d5 and 1 knight f6 to see how they perform across different levels. Overall, we see the typical 3% margin where white is doing a little bit better than expected. The numbers with 1 knight f6 are interesting here because white's expected score is only 46.2%. This is based on having a lower average rating overall for these 94 games. But anyway, it seems like white is outperforming their rating a bit in these games here. Now, when it comes to the scores across the different levels, we see a big difference here in terms of the scores against 1 d5 based on whether both players are under 1600 or above 1600. I'm not sure exactly what the reasoning for this one is, but clearly white is scoring better against 1 d5 at higher levels, which is surprising because d4, d5 is certainly one of the most solid options for black. And then when it comes to 1 knight f6, of course, this can still go many different ways. Black can still play something like the Nimzo Indian or go for something sharper like the King's Indian and Grunfeld. So I looked into it a bit deeper here to see what happens after d4, knight f6, c4, whether e6 scores better for black or g6 scores better. And what I found was actually that 2 g6, leading to either the King's Indian or the Grunfeld, is actually scoring much better than 2 e6, despite having a lower average rating compared to the opponent. So although the overall average rating of the players was higher that are going 2 e6 compared to who they were playing as white, it seems like black was just scoring better with 2 g6, which I thought was pretty interesting. And then after d4, d5, c4, both 2 c6, the Slav defense, and 2 e6, just the orthodox Queen's Gambit declined, seemed to score pretty okay for black, close to 50%. And then another thing that I found very interesting, of course, I wanted to check the London system, because I know the London is pretty popular, and see how it is scoring. And there wasn't a ton of games featuring a London, just 36 total. But white's score in these games was 58.5%, which is definitely significant, definitely a very, very good score for white to have for any opening. But then I looked into it, and what I noticed is that, as you might expect, the London system tends to score better at lower levels. And so lower levels, the London was scoring well, whereas as you go higher, then the scores start to taper off and white isn't doing as well. So this definitely, leads to the insight that perhaps the London is a better scoring opening at lower levels, and then once you start playing higher rated players, they are more equipped and more used to dealing with it and end up scoring better. Not the most surprising thing in the world, but shows that, the London is still going strong and is still very much a viable weapon for lower rated players. Despite what myself and many other coaches have said, it sounds like people are going to continue playing this one. And it might not be the best for overall chess development, but again, if you're playing something that you're happy with and it works for you, I don't really see a huge problem with it. So to sum up a couple of insights and trends that I observed, it seems like according to the games that were submitted, the lower rated you go, the more e4 becomes preferred over d4 in terms of the score, with the exception of the London system, which scores better at lower levels compared to higher levels. And then the higher rated you go, the more d4 starts scoring better compared to e4, again, with the exception of the London system. Also, the English seems to score very well at lower levels, as does the French, while the Caro-Kann seems to perform better at higher levels. And when it comes to the Sicilian, it seems like the best scoring option for white is the open Sicilian, regardless of which Sicilian black is playing. The open Sicilian is just scoring much better compared to any of the typical Sicilian sidelines. Lastly, I didn't mention this, but one thing I noticed is that 1 d6, the Pirtz defense, seems to score pretty well under 1600 as well. Not so much at higher levels, but there also weren't that many games featuring 1 d6. But 1 d6 may be something for e4 players to work on. So there you have it, folks. Once again, my idea here was not to try and draw any kind of serious conclusions here or to tell people to switch up their opening repertoires or anything like that, but rather just to look at the numbers and see if anything interesting would pop up. So should you now go and switch up your entire opening repertoire based on what you just saw? Maybe not, but it could be useful to at least think about what kinds of openings you are scoring well against and what kinds of positions you're struggling in, as that might give you some insight or detail as to what to work on. So with that, I hope you guys did find the video useful or at least interesting. Don't forget to like and subscribe, or whatever, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.